Hey guys, Brad here from Scooter Street. I'm really excited because today we have an SR50R in the shop. So this is the perfect opportunity to do a video I've been wanting to do for a while, which is SR50R Beast Mode. What are the best mods for the SR50R? Now I'm going to split this video up into two main parts. The first one is the one that you came here to see, which is best upgrades for the SR50R. Now even this first category, I'm going to split it up into two. First one's going to be the best street SR50R. What I mean by this is the best version of the SR50R that you can rip around on the street, daily ride, not have to do constant maintenance on, but still have a ton of fun. And the second part of this first category is going to be SR50R Ultimate Beast Mode. What is the most powerful, highest performing version of the SR50R that you can possibly build? Now the second main part of the video is going to be what are the common problems with the SR50R and how do you rectify them? Now the reason I'm putting this in, because the SR50R isn't available new anymore, if you're buying one of these to tune, unfortunately it's going to be a second-hand bike. So I thought it might be a great idea to go through what some of the common issues with the SR50R are, and even some of the not so common ones that we've come across over a couple of decades of working on these bikes in the shop, and what the easy permanent rectifications for these problems are if you come across them. Now the hard part for me here is going to be trying not to overload you with information. I've been working on these bikes particularly for like 12 years. At the shop, we've raced them in the Le Mans 24-hour race. We've a bunch of times, we won a bunch of times on an SR50, and we've built and tuned so many of these over the years of such a wide varying level of tuning. It's going to be hard for me to condense that all. So I'm going to try and condense this much information into this much of a video. But if you have some questions specific to your SR50 or some parts that you're looking to install on your bike, please let us know in the comments because I can't put everything in this video. We're going to start off with the engine. The SR50R is what we're talking about in this video, not to be confused with the SR50 Ditec, which is a totally different bike. So put that aside. This is just the SR50R, which came factory with a liquid-cooled Piaggio Hyper 2 engine. Now, if you've been following our channel for any length of time, you would know that the Hyper 2 is our favorite engine to tune, and the liquid-cooled Hyper 2 is the best version of this engine. Now, I know we're talking about the engine. I promise we're going to go deep into it in a second, but I just want to mention while we're on the subject, the thing that makes the SR50 so great is not just the engine, but it's the pairing of the best engine with the best handling chassis. Aprilia have gone to a great amount of effort to really get the handling geometry of these absolutely spot on. This is from the rake of the steering, the size of the wheels, the center of gravity, the wheelbase. Everything has been worked together to make a scooter that is just totally unparalleled in its handling. And then when you're doing over 150 k's an hour on a really highly tuned one of these, it is pretty confidence inspiring when you know that the bike can actually handle it. Back to the engine. So we're going to start off with our ultimate street setup. Now I'm going to put a list of all the parts down in the description for each of these setups to make it super easy for you. But this particular street setup is one that we developed over a number of years with a number of SR50R customers that we had at the shop. They'd be coming back continually, and we slowly over time chipped away at this setup to really fine tune it to the point that it's pretty much a copy and paste setup. You copy and paste this list, buy all the parts, bolt them to your bike, and it will A, be pretty easy to tune because all the parts work well together, and B, be super fun, super fast, and reliable. So starting off with the cylinder. Now, the best cylinder for this setup is the Malossi MHR Replica cylinder kit. Now, the best thing with this cylinder kit is it really threads the needle between a sport kit and a racing kit. The 9-port map, specifically the exhaust port, is a really good middle ground between a sort of a sport and racing kit. But the other thing is the piston is a twin ring piston. So the main thing with a twin ring compared to a single ring in a racing cylinder, the twin ring is going to give you a lot more longevity. So between rebuilds, a single ring piston you may be going to get 3,000 or 4,000 k's out of, depending on how you're riding between rebuilds of the piston. The twin ring kit, I've seen these MHR rep kits do like 15,000 k's plus on a single piston, again, depending on how you're riding. So it gives you that really good reliability and longevity of that particular component between having to do maintenance. Next up, we've got our exhaust. Now, it's probably not going to be a surprise to you. Our number one exhaust for the MHR rep is the 𝐂𝐡𝐞𝐤 R exhaust. Again, very similar to the MHR rep. The 𝐂𝐡𝐞𝐤 R really threads that needle quite well between a sport and a racing exhaust, and it really pairs so well with the MHR rep. It gets the most out of it without over exhausting the cylinder kit and potentially causing engine damage. The other thing with the 𝐂𝐡𝐞𝐤 R is they sound great, but they're not too crazy loud. I've had full race exhausts on my bike before and it was ridiculously loud. Even with a silencer repack, it was offensively loud and I was constantly attracting negative attention from, say, the police, and also not making my neighbors too happy. So the 𝐂𝐡𝐻 really threads that needle as well between having a good loud sound but not being too loud. I know it's a funny order, but we're going to work our way back up to the top of the engine to the intake. So first off, airbox. I would always recommend running a factory airbox on a street scooter. A, it makes it far easier to tune compared to a pod filter, and B, it's quieter. But C as well, in terms of reliability, a pod filter will have to be continually retuned throughout the year as the temperature and humidity changes. An airbox, not so much. The other thing with a pod filter is if you get caught in the rain in a pod filter, it really sucks. So the airbox is definitely the reliable, easy way to go. Now, moving back from our airbox, going to talk about carbs. Now with carbs, there's really two options that I would recommend for this setup. The best option is the Dell'Orto PHBG. Now these can come in a few different kits. Malossi makes some really great PHBG kits. I'd highly recommend buying a kit that comes with a genuine Dell'Orto because you can get some fake ones, but they're really rubbish. We've never really had a great experience with them in the shop. So whatever kit you buy, make sure it's coming with a genuine Dell'Orto PHBG. But in that, they come in a couple of different kits, the 19 and the 21. Generally, I'd recommend the 21 because there's really not much of a difference between them in terms of cost, so you're better off just going for the better option. Now, the thing with a PHBG is it's a manual choke only carb, and you'll also need to do some pilot jet tuning. So I've done a couple of videos on this in the past about PHBGs and tuning with the PHBG, but if you're relatively mechanically confident or you're willing to give it a go, you shouldn't have too much trouble with a PHBG. You will, however, need to do some pilot jet tuning as well as main jet tuning, and definitely some needle tuning as well to get the bike to run really well. If you're not mega mechanically inclined or you're not particularly confident, the other option I would recommend is the Dell'Orto PHVB 22. Now the reason I'd recommend the PHVB, also a 20.5 available, I believe. The PHVB is pretty much the big brother of the PHVA that these come with from factory, which is a 17.5mm. So you're going from 17.5mm up to 22. The thing with the PHVB that would maybe make you choose that over the PHBG is the PHVB is an auto choke carb, the same as the PHVA that it comes with from factory, so you don't have to worry about a choke lever or installing or mucking around with any of that. But the other thing with the PHVB is it's a little bit less performance-oriented carb in the sense that it's basically just an upgrade from the factory in terms of size, but everything else about it pretty much works the same. If you actually hold a PHVA up to a PHVB, they pretty much look the same. The PHVB is just a little bit bigger, and that probably encapsulates the whole point behind this carb, is it's just a slight upgrade on the factory. So it's going to require a lot less mucking around to get it to run right. You're not probably going to have to change the needle or the pilot jet. You're pretty much just going to bolt it on, plug the auto choke in, and sort your main jet out, and it's pretty much ready to ride. Whereas the PHBG, being a more performance-oriented carb, has a lot more adjustability, but it also needs a lot more adjustability because you have to muck around with it a bit more to get it to run right. Now, continuing to work our way down the intake, we come to our reed valve. Now, with this setup, you definitely get away with running the factory reed valve, maybe with some Malossi carbon petals. These petals actually come in the cylinder kit. One of the big advantages of these is the carbon petals tend to, over time, disintegrate. I have seen the factory petals, which on some of these are steel, on some of them they're like a Kevlar sort of material, but I have seen the steel ones before crack and splinter off and go into the engine and cause issues. So at the bare minimum, I'd highly recommend putting the Malossi carbon reeds in there. In an ideal world though, you'd go for the Malossi VL13 reed valve. This reed valve, the whole block actually increases the volume of air that can get into the engine. So for the price of it, and say you've bought all the rest of the parts, there's no point in bottlenecking the engine by running the factory reed valve. So it's best to put the VL13 in there. Next down in the line, we come to our crank. This might surprise you, but on this particular setup, I would not recommend putting a performance crank in the bike. Now that might seem silly, but the main reasoning is it's just not necessary. The factory crank in the Hyper 2, particularly in the Italian-made models, which the SR50R is so incredibly strong. Even the crank bearings are incredibly strong. I have never seen a factory SR50R crank fail, ever. I don't think I've even seen the crank bearings fail on a factory SR50R. Just keeping in mind that we've had many scooters over the years that have been highly tuned engines with a factory crank, have run for more than 20,000 Ks, no issues. So it's just not necessary. The only exception to this with the Piaggio engine, in some of the Sport City, SRMT and Piaggio Typhoon models, which are actually all the same bike, these are the Chinese manufactured models. I have on a few occasions seen the right crank bearing fail. I couldn't tell you why, but on a handful of them, I have seen them get really noisy and whirry and fail, but I've never seen it happen on one of the Italian manufactured engines, such as the one that comes in the SR50R. Now, this isn't to say that you wouldn't get a performance benefit from putting, say, a full circle high compression crank in this setup, and we have done that, but the difference in performance was pretty negligible. So on this particular setup, it's just not necessary for such a huge component replacement, and particularly the expense involved in purchasing and replacing a crank for the actual performance benefit that you get is pretty minimal. Now we get to our transmission. Now, the transmission is where much of performance tuning is either won or lost, because it's how you get that power to the road. It's an easy thought trap to fall into of thinking, I'm just gonna put all the go fast bits on it, and I'm just gonna skip the transmission because it doesn't really do anything. It really does. The transmission is between all those parts on the road. So if you don't have your transmission right, you're just wasting power. So doing your transmission really is highly important. I'd say just as important, if not more so, than the rest of those components. Now, the transmission upgrades that I would recommend on this setup, again, similar to the carb, you have a couple of different routes you can go. Now, the best route is to put a Malossi over-range transmission in the bike. It's going to get you the best performance for low and high end, and it's going to be the most fine-tunable setup as well. The downside of this is it's pretty expensive. So if you're not looking to spend that kind of money, you're looking for a sort of in-between option, what I would recommend is the Malossi MHR Variator. Now, the MHR Variator is actually just the front component of the over-range kit. So one big benefit of this is if you're staggering or wanting to break up the cost, you could do just the MHR Variator, and then later on down the line, buy the belt and the rear pulley. You need to have that belt with the full system, and then you've got a full over-range kit. So you can sort of break it up and do it in stages. Now, the reason I recommend the over-range kit, or at least the MHR over-range Variator, over just a standard Multivar 2000 from Malossi, is because the Multivar 2000 really shines on a standard or close to standard 50 or a sort of low-end setup. The MHR reps, like I said, it sort of threads that needle between sport and racing. It allows you to sort of go for some more racing-oriented parts on some areas of the bike, and the transmission's one of these. The MHR rep has enough power that it can actually get a fair bit of the potential out of the over-range kit. You don't need to have a full racing cylinder kit to have that over-range kit. So really, for the additional cost between a Multivar 2000 and an MHR Variator, it really is worth it. Now, working our way back a little further, we come to the diff gears. Now, diff gears are not a hard and fast set rule. Could do a whole video just on diff gears, but to keep it simple, basically, if you're looking for the best initial acceleration, keep it factory. If you're looking for higher top speeds and you're not so worried about sacrificing a little bit of acceleration to get them, you're probably going to want to do a gear up kit. Now, what we refer to as a gear up kit is changing either the primary or the secondary drive inside your diff. Now, what this does makes the gearing taller and basically allows the bike to get to higher top speeds, but just at the sacrifice of a little bit of acceleration. Basically, this comes down to preference. We've tuned bikes both with the factory diff gears and gear up kits over the years, and both run really well. It's just about that preference of what you want to do with your bike. My personal preference with diff gearing is keeping it factory for a street setup, and if you're going for a full race setup, then I would usually do a diff gear upgrade. Okay, so I'm in the future, I'm editing this video, and I realized I've forgotten two really important components, which is the belt and the clutch. Don't judge me too much. I'm rattling all this stuff off from pure memory, and it gets a little bit hard sometimes. We're gonna go through these two one by one. We're gonna start with the belt. The belt that we would generally recommend for this setup is the Malossi Special Belt. I have one just here. Now you might be thinking, why not a Kevlar belt? Well, there's a couple of reasons for this. The Special Belt is quite a bit more flexible and a little bit thinner than the Kevlar belt. So the Special Belt's a little bit closer to factory. It's sort of in between a Kevlar and a factory belt. Now the reason that a thinner, more flexible belt might be the thing that you would go for, this street setup, it's not a super high powered setup. Sometimes a Kevlar belt, because they're so stiff, the engine doesn't really have enough power to really pull the Kevlar belt all the way down into the bottom of the variator. It's very resistant to being to wanting to sort of bend that much to get all the way down around the variator shaft to get your lowest gearing. So the effect that this can sometimes have, and we've noticed many times over the years, is if you put a Kevlar belt in the bike, you actually lose a little bit of acceleration. That seems a bit silly, but on a higher powered setup, say a racing setup, a Kevlar belt is fine because the bike has enough power to overcome the stiffness of that Kevlar belt. But on a street setup like this, the Special Belt is a much better option because it's stronger than the factory belt, but it's also much more flexible than the Kevlar belt. So you get more strength to suit the higher power while maintaining that nice off-the-mark acceleration that you would get with the factory belt. And just to reiterate, so there's no confusion, you'd only be using a Special Belt with either the factory variator, a Multivar 2000, or the overrange variator. If you had the full overrange setup, front and rear, you obviously must use the overrange belt. You cannot use a Special Belt on that particular setup. Now we get to the clutch. Now, the clutch that we would recommend, the one that we've used and had the most success with over the years, is the Polini G3. We've used the G2 a few times over the years as well, but had some shuttering issues in particular with the G2. So we've sort of usually preferenced the G3. Now, the really great thing with the G3 clutch is it comes with a couple of sets of different clutch springs, but within that, it actually has adjustable clutch spring tension. Up here, this little system here, you've got a little hex screw here, and as you do that screw up, it actuates this little pin which pulls the spring, having the essential effect of tightening the spring. So within different sets of clutch spring stiffness, you actually have quite a bit of adjustability between them to make the clutch a bit stiffer or a bit less stiff, which is one of the reasons that we preference this clutch. You can actually, with this setup, use the factory clutch with just some stiffer clutch springs. The issue that we have seen with this over the years is the pad material on the factory clutch isn't as grippy as the pad material, or the shoe material you might call it, on a performance clutch. Say for instance, like the Polini clutch. The material on these is very similar to the material that you'd see on brake pads. On a high performance brake pad versus a factory brake pad, one of the main differences is a high performance brake pad is sintered, meaning it has a more aggressive pad material, generally has little bits of metal in there that increase the friction and increase the grabbing ability. It's exactly the same with clutches. So the Polini G3 clutch, for example, is a sintered material on the shoes. So when it grabs, it's much more aggressive. It aggressively grabs and it doesn't want to keep slipping. Factory clutches generally aren't sintered. They're more like a factory brake pad material. So what can happen is, over time, with lots of engagements, they start to slip because the shoe starts to glaze. It gets shiny. If you've ever pulled your factory clutch out, you might have seen this before. You have like a shiny patch on the clutch. Now, once it goes shiny, it starts to slip and shudder and cause problems. Now, you can overcome this by sanding the material, sanding the shoe, roughening it back up. But our experience has been with the factory clutch, it will pretty much continue this process of glazing up every so often, maybe every couple of months. You have to pull it back out, you'll have to resand it, because it's just not designed to engage at a higher RPM. So you gotta think that clutch is trying to grab, if you've put stiffer clutch springs in there, your engagement might be around 5,000 RPM. It's designed to engage at like 2,000 RPM. So it's spinning at 2.5 times the speed and trying to grab the bell. It's just not designed for this, which is why we'd usually recommend putting a performance clutch in there that has a grippier sintered material and is designed to grab onto the inside of the bell at those higher RPMs without getting glazed. Now, for a fun, fast, reliable street setup, that is about where I would leave it. Now, if you're an avid scooter tuner or pretty knowledgeable on the subject, you might be thinking I've left out a couple of crucial parts. Probably high up on that list is going to be an unrestricted CDI, or what Malossi call a TC unit, and maybe even an interrotor ignition. Now, I'll go through those one at a time. With the TC unit, or unrestricted CDI, The only reason that you would install one of these is because you're hitting the factory rev limit. That's really the only benefit that you're going to get from this that's going to be noticeable. So the factory rev limit on the Piaggio CDI is 11,000 RPM. I can tell you from copious experience that an MHR replica cylinder is not capable of hitting this limiter. I know because I've hit the limiter before on racing cylinder kits. You can't miss it. It's super obvious. It's a terrible noise, terrible feeling. If you were hitting this limiter in an MHR replica cylinder kit, you'd know it. You can't miss it. So the MHR replica kit is just not capable of hitting it. Really the only reason to install one of these would be if you're putting a higher end racing cylinder kit on it that was capable of hitting that limiter. Pretty much any Bridgeport kit is going to hit the limiter, and you're going to need to, at the bare minimum, do a TC unit or unrestricted CDI. Now the second thing there was an inner rotor ignition. Now to be clear, you would definitely get a performance benefit from putting an inner rotor ignition on virtually any scooter. The reason I didn't recommend it is because A, it's very expensive, but B, there's a couple of additional complexities with it. So say for instance the Malossi inner rotor ignition. It doesn't provide any power for your lighting or charge for your battery, which the factory stator does. So if you go put a Malossi inner rotor ignition, there are workarounds for the lighting, but there's not for powering your battery. So what you're gonna end up having to do is after every time you ride the bike, you're gonna have to have a battery charger at home. You're gonna have to connect up and plug the battery into charge, or you're not gonna have any power for your dash or your lighting or anything like that, which is gonna make it unroadworthy and not able to go on the road. So if you're willing to accept that level of annoyance in having to continuously recharge your battery, then go for an inner rotor ignition. My personal preference on that would be probably not to, unless it was a racing setup. Now, there is another option. MVT and a couple of other brands make inner rotor ignitions that do have either a lighting coil or a battery charge coil. Now, the way that the stator plug on the Piaggio engine is set up, say for instance you were to buy the MVT ignition, which has a lighting coil, you can actually reroute that and use it to power your battery and then work out another solution for the lighting. Those two, it's actually pretty easy to do this. But again, it's a big cost. An inner rotor ignition like the MVT is like $500 or $600 minimum. So are you willing to spend that much extra just to get a little bit more initial acceleration? That's a decision you're going to have to make, but I certainly wouldn't put it in the category of required on a setup like this. Okay, so we've got our street setup out of the way, and we come to our ultimate beast mode SR50R. Now, believe it or not, this is actually way easier to map out than it is for the street setup. The reason being, with the street setup, you have a fairly wide window of what will work and tune well together. With the racing setup, because everything's been pushed so to the limit, the window is actually very narrow to get everything right. And this is how it can actually be a little bit easier selecting parts for a racing setup. Because say for instance, Malossi, right? If you were gonna go with Malossi for a full racing setup, realistically, you have two main options. You either go with Malossi Team 2 or you go with Malossi RC1. So for instance, Team 2, right? You would go with Malossi Team 2 cylinder, Team 2 exhaust, Team 2 crank, you know, the over-range transmission, which I'd probably put in the Team 2 category as well. You know, Team 2 inner rotor ignition. You know, with your diff, again, it's the same thing, it's a preference thing. But everything's pretty well mapped out for you. The other option would be to go for an RC1. So the RC1, within, you know, the RC1 engine, you have actually realistically a couple of options within that. You can take your factory crank casing, so your factory engine casing, and you can take it, you know, put a lot of the RC1 parts on it. So for instance, the Testarossa cylinder kit, you've got the 70 or the 94cc, and then basically the rest of it's all mapped out after that. You buy most of the RC1 componentry, or the other option, which is the most expensive, I would say, is the actual full beast mode of the SR50R, is you buy a full Malossi RC1 94cc entire engine kit, which comes with everything, all the instructions to bolt it all together. And it's literally a bolt-in engine that gets you something like 31 horsepower or something. Totally ridiculous, verging on unrideable. You might think 31 horsepower is not that much, but 31 extremely angry two-stroke horsepower in a bike that weighs like 100 kilos. It's pretty quick, particularly when you have a CVT that's keeping it at peak power all the time. So it becomes almost unrideable pretty quickly. Now, I mentioned that we've built a lot of street setups over the years because that's probably what's more common, but we have built quite a few of these race setups as well. One of them we did in a video a few years ago, which we filmed building sort of the base engine of an SR50R. You know, probably 6 or 7 years ago, I built my last SR50 that I had that had a full racing setup in it, full Velocity Team 2. And that was properly quick. That was probably around the 20 horsepower. That was well and truly enough to be fast. You know, be able to keep up with 250 or 300cc motorbikes, particularly in the twisty sections if you want to go for a ride up in the mountains or the hills. They can be really fun, these setups. But what's really different about building a racing setup to a street setup is with the street setup, most of those parts that I mentioned in the street setup build, you can kind of do them in a stage, you know, chip away at them one by one. You know, if you do them in the right order, obviously you're not going to put a big carb on a factory 50cc cylinder, but you know, if you start with the exhaust and then do a cylinder kit and then do a carb and then, you know, you can slowly chip away at them. With a racing setup, because that window of tuning is so narrow, you have to do it all at once or you pay the penalty. So a good example, my white Piaggio ZIP that we did the big burnout video, sort of breakdown video on the channel, you know, a couple of months ago. That bike has a racing cylinder kit, racing crank, sort of not quite a racing exhaust, but a relatively high level exhaust, and some transmission work, but it doesn't have an inter-rotor ignition. Now, because of this, it means that the initial acceleration sucks. That cylinder kit needs to rev really quickly to a really high RPM to make power. And while it's dragging all the weight of the factory flywheel along, it really struggles. So it means that the initial acceleration kind of sucks. So what I've had to do to compensate for that is make the rollers really, really light. Now, this gives it a, you know, a decent initial acceleration, but it means that past about 40 k's an hour, the bike kind of sucks to ride. You know, obviously that tuning difficulty has limited the ability of the scooter because really it needs an inter-rotor ignition. Now I will put one in it, but for the time being, it's kind of a pain in the butt. Now this is what I mean with racing setups. You have to do it all. You can't stagger your way up there because, you know, I don't really ride that bike on the road. So, you know, how it is now, just for mucking around, having fun, it's fine. But if I was going to try and ride that bike actually around and use it as a proper scooter, it's just not really practical at all. It doesn't really do the job. So it needs the full setup. And this is what I mean by racing setups. You have to fully commit to the whole setup. I could talk about Piaggio race engine tuning all day, but we'd never get to the rest of the video. So we're going to jump along to the chassis tuning component. Now, the reason this is together is because street and racing chassis tuning, it's kind of not really a lot of difference. What I mean by that is the chassis on the SR50R is so good just from factory, you could leave it and honestly it would be fine. That being said, there are improvements that can be made. So, you know, it's going to be up to you, whether it's street or race setup, which improvements you want to make, where you want to spend the money. Because with things like, you know, shock absorbers and it can get really expensive really quickly. So you're going to have to draw that line for yourself of, you know, which components you want to do and which that you don't. Now I'm going to start off with the things that make, honestly, the most difference. These are really the 3 weak points of the SR50 chassis, and they're usually the ones that you'd expect. This is tires, brakes, and suspension. Now the good news is for all 3 of these, you have quite a few options all the way from budget up to full racing. So I'm going to go through them one at a time. Okay, so we'll start off with tires. From factory, they come with a Sava MC16 tire. These are a pretty ordinary tire, if I'm honest. So the best option that I have found and have used for quite a number of years is the Michelin Power Pure. Now this is a dual compound tire, so it's a hard rubber in the center, so you get good longevity out of it, but then it's really nice soft rubber on the sides of the tire. So when you're coming into your corners, you have lots and lots of grip. We've raced with these tires and it honestly made a pretty dramatic difference. Now, one thing with these tires is availability is a bit of an issue. Sometimes they're available, sometimes they're not. So if you can't get the Power Pure, the Michelin City Grip 2 was a really great option, and the Pirelli SL26 is also a great option. Neither of them are a dual compound tire, but they're sort of the next best option if you can't get the Power Pure. Now, another relevant thing with the tires, something cool you can do, and I've done on pretty much all of my SR50Rs, is the factory size is a 130/60/13 front and rear, but what you can do is put a 140/60/13 on the rear. Now what this does, obviously a 140 is wider than a 130, but when you're putting it on a rim that was designed for a 130, it tends to balloon out a bit more when it's inflated. It makes the overall circumference of the wheel a little bit bigger, which of course has a similar effect to putting a gear up kit in the bike. Now, it's not quite as dramatic of an effect as putting a gear up kit in, but it will get you sort of an extra 5 to 6 k's an hour additional top speed. And because it's not as much of an effect as doing a gear up kit, you don't really lose as much initial acceleration as you would with a gear up kit. So it's kind of a good middle ground between not doing a gear up kit and doing a gear up kit. Now, the other effect that putting a 140/60/13 will have on the rear is it'll make the bike feel more stable, particularly around corners. If you were building just a race bike, you'd keep the 130 on there because it'll keep it really nice and twitchy, be able to flick from left to right corners really fast. If you're riding on the road and you're not doing such aggressive cornering maneuvers, it actually is quite a nice stable feel having that 140 on the rear. It just makes the bike feel overall a lot more planted on the road, a bit more predictable, and sort of dulls the handling, flicking it from left to right a little bit, which on the road I think is probably a nicer feel overall. You're not sort of wrangling the bike quite as much to keep it on a stable path. Now, while we're down here, we may as well move on to braking. So the factory braking on the SR50R is a 190mm disc front end rear, and front end rear is twin opposing pot calipers, so 2 pistons moving in. Now, these are pretty limited from factory, honestly. They're not fantastic. There used to be some really cool options in terms of braking upgrades. One of them was Stage 6 used to make a 260mm upgrade disc, so this is a dramatically bigger disc. It was as big as you could make it without the caliper hitting the wheel. They're not available anymore, frustratingly, and they did make a dramatic difference. So it's a bit of a shame, but got to work with what we've got. So there are a couple of upgrades that you can make to the brakes. One of them is you can do an upgrade disc like this. Galfa make some different discs like this, couple other options available. These are a wave disc. Do these make a difference to the braking? Not really. They will cool a little bit quicker than a factory disc, but unless you're racing, you're probably not really going to get any benefit out of this. What does make a difference, however, is installing better brake pads. So Malossi make these racing pads. Really the difference between these and a factory pad is these are sintered. So these have, I'm not going to go into the full explanation of what the difference is, but basically the material on these is far more grippy, far harsher. So it will wear your disc out a little bit faster. It's not like it's going to wear it out every 2,000 Ks or something. It's still a manageable amount of wear, but the difference in the braking capacity is, it's not a negligible difference. It honestly does make a really big difference to the braking ability. So definitely worthwhile. Honestly, even for a street build, I would highly recommend putting a set of these pads in the bike because it really does make a difference. The other thing is the hotter these pads get, the better they work. Factory pads are generally the opposite. The hotter they get, the less effective they work. So if you're going out for big, long, hard rides, really, really worthwhile. So moving on to suspension. Now with our forks, there's not tons of options for the SR50R in terms of forks. My understanding is Stage 6 either still does or at some point did make an upgrade set of forks. I don't know whether these are still available. The factory forks honestly aren't too bad. If you were really fussed about it, you could probably take them to a suspension tech and he'd be able to change the viscosity of the fluid inside them to maybe make them, add a little bit more dampening. But honestly, the front forks is not going to be your big concern. They're pretty good from factory. One hint I will give you though, see this thing here? It's just a stupid, annoying chrome sticker they've put on there from factory. If you reach behind it, you'll actually feel a seam where the sticker has been wrapped around, and you can unwrap it and it makes the whole lower section of the fork just this nice grey colour, and it looks loads better. Now coming to the rear suspension, we have quite a lot more option here, primarily just because of the ease of replaceability of the rear shock. You can just bolt it in, bolt it out, and it's a much smaller component than the entire front forks. So it's cheaper and easier to replace and work on than the front forks. Now, there are quite a lot of really great options for the rear shocks on the SR50R. The YSS Pro X is a really great budget option. It's not fully adjustable, but it does have a bunch of different click setting adjustments. And while it's not fully adjustable, the softest setting on this shock is still significantly stiffer than the factory shock. So it's well and truly enough adjustment there for you. On top of that, the actual damping ability of the rear shock on the Pro X is quite a lot better than the factory shock. Now, if you're looking for something a bit more high performance, there's so many options available for these, like the Malossi RS24 is probably getting pretty up there. You can spend over $1,000 on a rear shock, and I'm sure they are really great, but unless you're racing, a full racing shock's just not necessary. Now, another great alternative to the RS24 Malossi, the S6RT or the Stage 6 racing technology, they have a couple of really great rear shocks for these. I have installed one of these before on a customer scooter. I forget the exact model name, but it was the one with the external reservoir up the top, and it was of course fully adjustable. This did make a huge difference. Now, his scooter in particular was a really high-powered racing setup, so I feel like a stiffer rear shock or a high-performing rear shock was probably more necessary on his than the average street build. But again, it's up to you how much money you want to spend on different componentry and what you want to prioritize spending the money on. Now, the other tuning option with the rear is obviously suspension riser blocks. Now, this is usually an aluminium block that bolts between the shock mount on the engine and the bottom of the shock, and essentially just makes the rear shock longer. Now, there is a benefit to this, particularly if you have a bike that wants to lift the front wheel all the time. It sort of angles the bike down a bit more and will sort of help prevent it from wanting to do this all the time. The negative of this is it does make the steering more twitchy and less comfortable. So it does this by changing the rake angle because the back of the bike's sitting up further, which means that your forks are now sitting more upright. It changes the feeling of the steering. I personally don't like the feeling. Maybe you'd get used to it over time. It depends how much you're rising it to. You know, if you're using a really big, tall riser, it's going to really negatively impact the steering. If you're using maybe a less aggressive riser, some of their risers are actually adjustable with multiple hole positions. So you could muck around with that and just see what the feel of the bike is with different positions and find a position that's comfortable for you. I don't like the feeling of them at all. I never have, and I wouldn't personally have one on one of my bikes. Now we get to the last part of the video, and that's common issues and problems with the SR50R. Now, I'm going to split this up between chassis and engine because most of the engine problems are just common between all Piaggio engines. There's not many, but there are a few common ones. Now, starting off with the chassis, there's really only two problems that I've seen occur more than once with an SR50R chassis. Now, these problems are super rare. I think I've seen one of them 3 times and the other one twice. Now, they sound like major problems, but these are super, super rare. And in both occasions, these were on bikes that have been pushed really, really hard. Now, the first one is cracking of the engine cradle. Now, the engine cradle sits between the chassis and the engine. The engine bolts to the cradle and the cradle bolts to the actual chassis itself with a little rubber bush to stop vibrations from the engine working its way into the chassis. Now, engine cradle cracking is pretty serious. Like I said, I've seen this happen 3 times, and all 3 cases the bike had been pushed really, really hard over a long period of time. One of them, the bike had like 30,000 Ks plus and was highly tuned. So I think it's probably something that you should check for if, maybe once a year in a big, service sort of check. Is it something that you should be worried about? Absolutely not. I wouldn't be worried about this. It's incredibly rare. The second issue is the spline of the rear wheel where it actually attaches to the drive shaft, stretching, causing movement of the rear wheel side to side. Again, I've seen this twice. Once was on one of our race bikes. We ran 2 race bikes one particular year of the 24-hour race, and one of them got crashed like 30 times. And that was one of the bikes that had this issue. Honestly, I think it was something had to go. The bike had been crashed and pushed that hard, and eventually it went. The other one was on another bike, a customer's bike that had also been highly tuned and pushed really hard. He hadn't had any crashes, but there was a slight amount of side-to-side movement, and this wasn't great. You're always going to get a little bit of side-to-side movement through the drive shaft as it's sitting on bearings, and this is normal, but this movement was actually on the spline of the wheel, not on the drive shaft. So we had to replace the wheel, unfortunately, in both of these circumstances. Now, like I said, both of these are incredibly rare and they're not things that you should be worried about. But in the interest of being completely fair and not withholding information in this video, I thought I would mention it because these are issues that did occur more than once. Now, in terms of common engine problems, the Piaggio engine really only has 1/2 problems commonly that I'm aware of, and that's over many, many years of working on these. The first one is degradation of the rubber components in the intake. So this is the intake manifold, and on the SR50R in particular, the little boot that goes from the airbox to the carby. The rubber degrades over time, it cracks, and it causes an air leak. Now, the air leak obviously leans the bike out and can cause it to seize if you don't get on top of it. It can also cause it just to run very poorly. Most of the time it just runs poorly, and this is enough for most people to notice something's wrong and go looking for a problem and find it before it seizes the engine. The other sort of common problems, I say sort of common because I've only seen them a couple of times in each case, but they are unique to the Piaggio engine. The first of which was some of the early Piaggio engines, in particular the SR50R. The reed valve petals were made of steel. Now, in some cases, the steel could sort of crack and splinter off, and bits of the petal would work their way into the engine. Obviously, you're not supposed to have pieces of metal floating around the inside of your engine, so that would cause piston seizure or worse. Now, I've seen this twice, ever. The later models of the Piaggio engine moved to like a Kevlar sort of composite reed valve petal, and this issue was completely eliminated. If a piece were to break off, it would go in the engine and just burn up and not cause a problem. Now, the other one is stator plug connection failure. Now, I've seen this one a few more times, probably 6 or 7 times. This one actually happened on even my personal Piaggio Zip, although we had discovered it at the shop far earlier. And this is actually a pretty easy problem to solve. Internally, the plug loses connection, and it will sort of intermittently cut in and out. It sort of feels like spluttering, but sort of slightly different. It's difficult to describe, but basically the power to the bike is being cut on and off really rapidly as you're riding. So, in some cases, like on my Zip, it actually causes it to not start sometimes. It would intermittently you couldn't start it, and then you'd come out to it next day and it would start first go. It was very frustrating. So the first time we come across this problem, it was very difficult to diagnose. It took us days. It was very frustrating. After this first time, we knew to look for it when we saw this issue, particularly this funny intermittent spluttering issue, because it sort of presents as a combustion problem. The stator plug was the last place we were going to look. So once you know to look for that problem when you're having a strange stuttering issue, it's a very easy problem to fix. You can go to an electronics store, get a replacement waterproof 6-pin plug, move the connections over, piece of cake. If you don't have access to this, you can just hardwire it. It does make a bit of a pain if you have to replace the stator at a later point because you have to cut all the wires and re-hardwire them, but it's definitely a permanent solution because it can't happen again. Thanks for watching, guys. Look, we really appreciate the support. If you found this video useful or you got something out of it, please, if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button if you want to see some more content like this. And if you want to see us do a breakdown video or a best mods beast mode video of your scooter, please let us know in the comments what scooter you've got so we can aim our content at the right people. And definitely if we get one of your scooters in the shop, we'll try and do a video of that one.